Welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. The internet describes a vignette as a portrait photograph which fades into its background without a definite border. Now I think that's what most of us think of as a vignette. Another says that vignetting is often an undesired effect caused by camera settings or lens limitations. Now this is true of course because Photoshop includes a vignetting option in the lens correction part of Adobe Camera Raw. There's also a post-crop vignette in the effects section of Adobe Camera Raw. Now I use a vignette on nearly all of the images that I create in Photoshop, but most people are not going to directly notice them, not unless I show you a before and after. So I think we can say that a vignette can be applied as a creative edit or as a corrective one. The creative one is intended to be seen, the corrective one isn't. So maybe we could start with this video by looking at a creative vignette first. And this is Photoshop, so there's going to be an awful lot of ways to do this. Now I don't want to get bogged down showing in a video every different way there is to create a vignette. I'm going to pick on a technique which I think is versatile and go with that. Even then we have options, and maybe I can call those formal and informal. Let's make a start with this snow scene. What I'm going to do is apply a formal vignette using an oval selection. The problem we have when we make selections, of course, is how big do we make the oval. I'm going to pick up my elliptical marquee here, and I could click and drag and make a very small oval shape, or I could click and drag right at the top left corner and make a very big one. How do we know what size we need? Well, we don't, to be honest, until we start to apply the vignette itself. So what I'm going to do is to just start a little way in up at the top left corner, and I'm going to click and drag to create an oval sitting over the image, as you can see, something like that. Once I've created the oval, I can move inside of the selection and I can move it around, and you'll notice that the smart guides help us to position that smack bang in the middle of the image. So we can't get much more formal than an oval shape that's sitting right in the middle of our image. Now as you probably know, the area we've got currently selected is the inside of our selection, and we want the outer edge to be selected, so we need to go up to our select menu at the top of the screen and we need to choose inverse. Now there's a shortcut key for this that may be worth writing down on a piece of paper in front of your keyboard, because we may be using it quite a lot. Ctrl+Shift+I. Now you can see my selection is on everything but the center part. I said in the introduction we've got options. Well, one of those options is, with the selection made, I could go to select and mask. I could choose a view menu that I like, and one of those that's going to be perfect for this is black on white. And I could put a degree of feather into this, but once again, how do I know how much feather is going to work with the image? Well, I don't know for certain. So here's another way, which amounts to much the same thing, but I'll just cancel this for a moment. What I'm going to do over in the layers on the right hand side is go down to the bottom, just to the left of the bin, and create a new blank layer sitting over the top of my snow scene. If you look over to the left hand side at the toolbox, you'll see that I've got a grey colour as my foreground, but the background appears to be white. If you're not sure whether your background is pure white or your foreground is black and white, just hit the D key and it reverts back to black and white. Now I can flood the selection that I've made, and I've created a new layer for it simply by using Ctrl+Backspace, which floods my background color. Then I can hit Ctrl+D to remove the selection. Well, we do have our vignette, but it's not very attractive. So what I can do now, because I'm working on a new layer that just contains the white, I can go to my filters menu. I can choose one of the blur tools. I'm going to choose Gaussian blur. Let's tuck this down at the bottom right. But now I can move the slider here to the right while looking at my image, so I can gauge the effect that I'm looking for. I can have it very tight but a little bit soft. I can have it so broad that it starts to encroach on the image itself. I'm going to suggest, I'm looking at my image, I think something like that looks quite good. So I can click OK to that. So if we were happy with the result, we would just flatten those two layers together, and there's the vignette done. And of course the advantage of working like this is if this one didn't pan out too well, I can just drop it in the bin and we can have another go. Now we do have one or two other options to adjust the vignette we've created. If you look at the top of the church, we're losing that feature on the roof. And the sky here is quite white anyway, so I could probably distort this layer and reveal that without losing my vignette. Now we can do that by going to our free transform. We'll find them in the edit menu at the top left of the screen, edit free transform, but Ctrl+T is the shortcut, and you'll see a bounding box appears around the outer edge. Now Photoshop has reversed the operation of this tool in the latter part of 2018, ready for their 2019 version. So in the past, to distort the shape we've created on layer 1 over on the right hand side, we would simply click that center toggle at the top and just drag it upwards. But now we have to hold the Shift key. So I'm going to hold the Shift key and drag that up, because I can distort the vignette that I've made. I can reveal that roof feature, but I'm not affecting the rest of the vignette. When I'm happy, I can hit the tick to commit the change. And of course, when I'm happy with the result, then I can flatten those two layers to finish. But I always give this piece of advice. It's always a good idea to save any creative work like this as a Photoshop file, so you retain both layers, so you can do the work on one day and make sure you're still happy the next. But assuming we are, then we can go to the top right of the layers here and we can flatten the image to finish. Now as you can see by the image that's appeared on screen, different image, exactly the same technique. I've made my oval shape. This time I'm going to use the shortcut keys to inverse this. Remember, it's in the select menu. Select inverse, but Ctrl+Shift+I will do the job for us. Then I'm going to go down to the bottom of the layers, create my new blank layer, and I'm going to flood that with white. Ctrl+Backspace will do that. Ctrl+D will remove my selection. Now we need to soften that edge, so I'm going to go back to my filters menu and back to my blur and Gaussian blur. I'm going to give this a pretty high value, something well above 400. This is an image from a 20 megapixel camera to give you a feel for the resolution. I'm going to click OK, because sometimes when we create a vignette, let's say I'm happy with the vignette left and right and most of the corners, but I'd like that top section to be just a little whiter, and also the bottom section. Well, I'm going to adjust my vignette, but I'm going to do it manually. It's very quick. All we need to do is go back and select a new blank layer. We're going to do a little bit of painting, but it makes no sense to paint onto the oval. We know the oval is 90% of what we want, so if we're going to make an adjustment, let's make it on a new layer, so if the adjustment doesn't go right, I can just throw that in the bin and have another go. What we need to do is to go over to the toolbox. We need to select a standard soft edge brush. So let's move over to the toolbox. The brush is just the standard basic brush, and there you can see what I've got here. I can change the size of the brush using the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P, but that brush size looks pretty good for what I want. I'm going to be using the brush with the opacity up at 100%, but the flow rate, I'm going to put that down to about 5%. And with this little indentation or box checked here, I can adjust the flow rate with the numbers on the keyboard. So 0.5 will give me 5%. Now with white as my foreground color, I can just brush over the top of my vignette to just tease it down a little bit, but I know whatever I'm doing here is on a new blank layer, so all my work is fail safe, and I can do the same down the bottom. And you can see I can take all effect of those few waves right down the bottom away if that's what I want to do. But when I'm happy with what I've done, I can select both of those, I can right click, and I can choose just to merge those layers. We've got a bit of a problem here, because although I'm happy with my vignette, if I turn it on and off, you can see it's actually encroaching the guy here. I don't want that, so I want to tease it out just a little bit here. Now the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use a layer mask. If you're not into layer masks, you could use your eraser tool. Use it with a big brush, just like I've got here, but use it at a very low setting. But I'm going to go back to the layer that's creating the vignette, and I'm going to go down to the bottom of the layers and add a mask. Now what I need to do here is, with my mask selected, and you can see it's selected by the frame it has around it, is to paint black onto my image in much the same way, the delicate way that I've sprayed white at the top and the bottom. Now I can change the white and black in my color picker by touching the X key. So you can see I can always bring black to the foreground or background just by touching that key. Because when I've got a mask in place, I need to spray black, but I'm going to stay with the same settings. In fact, I could possibly even drop the flow rate down a little more. But I'll use exactly the same. I'm going to drop the size of my brush just a little bit, and I'm going to use a left and right movement just to make sure I move any effect of that vignette away from my fisherman, so that I don't get that little ghost effect around him. And that's all I needed to do. Very, very quick and very, very simple. Now what I'm also going to do is I'm going to reselect my vignette, because we don't always have to have the vignette in white, do we? If I lock the transparent pixels here, then I can flood color just into that layer alone. What color would I use? Well, how about selecting one from the image beneath? So let me go to the left, pick up my eyedropper tool. I'm using a 5x5 average from the top here. So I'm going to click somewhere in here, and you can see I've got a fairly pale blue appeared in the foreground of my color picker. And because I've got my layer locked, the transparent pixels locked, if I now hit Ctrl+Backspace, which floods the foreground color, now I've got that blue tone in the background. Can't say that's an absolute favorite, but that's the beauty of digital. I've still got the eyedropper tool. Let me try a slightly darker blue, Ctrl+Backspace. That works a lot better, doesn't it? And of course we could always use levels or hue and saturation to adjust it still further. Now here's another thought with our vignette. Anytime we add computer generated color to an image, the one thing the computer generated color doesn't have is pixels, so it can look a little bit smooth and unnatural. Now I can probably demonstrate this by just picking up my move tool. I'm going to just move my vignette a little bit, then I'm going to zoom in to the top of the page. I'm going to go in quite high. So there you can see exactly what I'm saying. I've gone a little bit too much, so I'll go back down. In the image itself, we're beginning to see the pixels that make up the image, but here it's very smooth and computer-like. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a little bit of noise, and I'll try to balance it with the photographic part of the image. So with the layer selected, not the mask, we can go to Filter. We're going to go to Noise and Add Noise, and we don't want anything like that, but we probably could do with something around 2 or 3%. 2% I think is going to do what we need. I'll hit OK, Ctrl+0. I'll just move that back into position. See, it's snapping into position for me. So there we've got another alternative for a vignette. Now if I wanted to do a similar thing with a picture like this, I'd use exactly the same techniques we've just talked about, but maybe I would use an informal shape. So rather than select my elliptical marquee tool, I could just select my lasso tool. I often refer this to my freehand lasso because, as you can see, I can just draw a shape exactly where I need it. Once again, I'm going to speed up the process here because we've seen the technique. Ctrl+Shift+I. Here's another shortcut for you. Ctrl+Shift+N and hit the Enter key, and we've got a new blank layer. My selection's in place. Looking over at the bottom of my toolbox, I've got the wrong colours, so I can touch the D key to bring them back into place. Ctrl+Backspace to flood with white, Ctrl+D to remove the selection. You can see I've done all of that without touching the screen with my cursor at all. Simple shortcuts have got us to the point where now we've just got to add that degree of blur. So let's do that. Let's go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. Let's drop that right the way down, and we'll just gradually move up to get the effect we're looking for. And you can see the water is gradually bleeding into the background once I get to about 130 something. But once again, I could be happy with that, couldn't I? And click OK. But even here, I've got a situation where I may want to adjust things. I've got water here which I'd like to hide a little bit. Maybe a little darkness around here I'd like to hide. So I can do that in exactly the same way. I just add a new blank layer. I make sure I've got white as my foreground. I pick up a fairly large brush. I'm using my flow rate at about 5%, and I'm just going to paint over these areas, being quite gradual about it and measured. You have to do this quite a bit to have the effect you want, but as I say, delicate work is the best way to work, and even if I wanted to do something down here, well, you get the idea. Once we're happy, of course, we can amalgamate either just the two layers that form the vignette, and even here we've got the opportunity to add colour and maybe noise, or we can leave it in white. Now what I've just opened up on screen is an image which is a raw file. You can see I've opened it up into Adobe Camera Raw, and I've made all of the changes that I want to make to the image. I hope you'll agree it's quite a reasonable image, but what I want to do here is to look at a vignette, but this time we're looking at one which is going to be corrective rather than creative, although we could always argue it's a bit of both. Now to apply the vignette here, I'm going to use a more formal shape, so I'm going to move up to my radial filter at the left part of the screen at the top and click. Now I get the opportunity here to click and drag, and as you can see I can drag out a shape. I can move inside it and move the shape around. I can go to the toggles and I can adjust the size to fit the image on screen. I can even rotate it if I need a slight variation. What I'm also going to do is to delete that, and then I'm going to reselect it, because another way to apply it is just to double click the screen, and you can see Photoshop lodges that oval in the perfect place all around the edge. Now if you look over on the right hand side, we've got loads of changes we can make to the outside of that oval, because I've got outside selected here. We can change the inside, but we're interested in the outside. We can feather the edge of this to any degree that we want, and as you can see I've got about 56 here. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to drop down the exposure, but before I do that I'm going to touch the V key. The V key just hides that selection. It's still there and it's still working. So when I bring my exposure down, look at the difference that it makes to the image, especially when I touch the P key and we can see the before and after. The picture looked okay before, but now we've just added that little bit of a vignette around the edges and the corners. It just seems to give the image more impact, focuses our attention into the center of the image, maybe helps us to make the journey up that rushing water to the left of the big rock and then round and into the sea. Now, one of the great things about working in RAW like this is we can always adjust it. So if I touch the V key again, you can see the pin, which I need to click to liven it back up, brings it back into play. So even now I can adjust my oval. If I felt the need to bring it in a bit, I can adjust the feather, I can adjust the exposure, or I could even adjust the saturation. If I wanted more in the outer edge, I could give it. If I wanted to take a little off, maybe to emphasize color in the center, I can do that too. It's a vignette, but it's quite a complex one, and in most cases the viewer is not going to actually notice that it's been placed in the picture, but it's going to do a good job. Now what I've done here is to remove the radial filter I've just demonstrated in Camera Raw, but I've opened up the image into Photoshop. Suppose we were working with a JPEG, or we'd completely finished the image and our vignette was an afterthought. Well, we can still apply it. We can either apply it using that formal shape of an oval, which we've looked at in various ways, or we could just go to our freehand lasso tool. I could make a lasso shape around the edge, and sometimes this is good because we can make sure we avoid areas that are already quite dark. Then I've got the opportunity to inverse that selection. So up at the top of the screen, select inverse, Ctrl+Shift+I is the shortcut. But what I'm going to do here now is go up to select and mask, select that, and I'm going to put in a fair degree of feather here. Usually I found from experience that if we're going to be working on a 20 megapixel image, which is what we've got here, then I'm going to need to be somewhere up above 350 odd, and that looks okay to me. It's certainly going to be enough to demonstrate what I need to demonstrate. I'm going to output this feather to the selection I've already got in place, so click OK to that. What we can do here, we can hide the selection here as well using Ctrl+H. Then I'm going to use my levels to just darken down the outer edge. We'll find the levels way up at the top left in the image menu. Adjustments and levels, there's the shortcut, Ctrl+L. I just want to move that mid-tone slider here to the right, and there you can see we've done exactly the same as we did in Camera Raw. We don't want to go too far so it can be seen, but we can do it just a little bit, and then to be certain that we've got it right, if you just untick the preview, there's your before and after. Maybe I've gone a little heavy there, so I could back off. You get the idea. We've achieved the same result. Now to bring this to a close, I'm just going to back away from what I've just done. First thing I'm going to do is to hit Ctrl+H because we've still got a hidden selection in place. But I'm going to hit Ctrl+Z to undo the darkening of the corners. I could even hit Ctrl+Z and take away my selection, but I think we'll stay with that. So we could create a similar selection inverse it as we did here, and we've softened that selection here. Rather than make a change to the outer edge, what we could do is we could copy that to a new layer. So if we hit Ctrl+J, you can see what I've got above this image. Doesn't look very impressive when we see it on its own, but what we could do now is to darken that down in exactly the same way as we did before. So this time let me bring up my levels with Ctrl+L, and we just move that center slider, so we're creating exactly the same effect. Why should we consider working like this? Well, it does give us the opportunity to say we've got too much darkening in one area, so if we wanted to lift it in a certain area, we could add a layer mask. We could select a standard soft edge brush. We could select a flow rate of something like 5 or even 10%, because if I wanted to remove any effect of a vignette down at the bottom here, then I could wipe my brush over here and maybe just lighten some strategic areas of the image. It just gives you one extra bit of control when you're creating that vignette. So when we first start thinking about a vignette, then this sort of image is what comes to mind. And sometimes it can be an image from the past, a historic image, and sometimes we see that being displayed in sepia tone. But in actual fact, a vignette can be much more subtle than this, both creative and corrective.